It's now my great pleasure to welcome our witnesses. First, we will have Alexander von Bismarck. Sasha is the Executive Director of the Environmental Investigation Agency and has been a great resource to the committee.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Trade, thank you for inviting me to appear before the subcommittee today to discuss trade measures to protect the environment. I've investigated illegal trade in natural resources for nearly 3 decades, and my organization, the Environmental Investigation Agency, has presented evidence that helped instigate trade-based environmental measures, including the international ban on ivory trade, the timber annex to the Peru Free Trade Agreement, amendments to the Lacey Act, and recently the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. Well-chosen policies can bring transparency to trade that allows us to benefit from it. Without these policies, trade can make us unwitting supporters and dependents of crime and violence overseas and a loss of economic resilience at home. Mr. Chairman, the enforcement of existing measures, as you mentioned, is critical, but I'd like to take these 5 minutes to focus on what I think is the most important and tangible opportunity for policy that we have, and that is to pass legislation which can battle deforestation by requiring more transparency from commodity imports. Over the past decade, the world has lost an area of forest the size of Virginia every year. In the first 6 months of 2022, nearly 1 million acres of Amazon rainforest were destroyed, representing the highest deforestation rate since 2016. Forest loss is among the biggest contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss, and a root cause of zoonotic disease. Forests provide livelihood and food for over 1 billion people, but they are stolen from indigenous peoples and local communities by organized crime, feeding corruption and destabilizing nation states. The cause is primarily commercial agriculture overseas. Cattle and soy in South America and palm oil and pulp in Southeast Asia, for example, drive 60% of deforestation, and more than 2/3 of this occurs illegally. And resulting products such as palm oil, cocoa, and beef are commonly linked to forced and child labor. The U.S. is a major source of the demand that drives this destruction. As one example, we have recently become, we the United States, the second largest importer of Brazilian beef, which means under current conditions, we as Americans are financing illegal deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon and undercutting any cattleman or woman anywhere in the world that is playing by the rules. My organization is about to publish further evidence that car manufacturers in the U.S. are using leather coming from cattle linked to illegal deforestation. Both could easily be avoided if we created a level playing field requiring greater transparency about the actual origin of these products. The European Union announced last week their agreement on a new regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, and the UK is developing its own policy. This means the US is threatening to lag behind and to offer a safe haven for commodities coming from illegally cleared land, leaving our farmers even more exposed to brutally unfair and globally destructive competition. The Bipartisan Forest Act has been introduced by the chairman and Congressman Fitzpatrick, and it takes this issue head-on by prohibiting agricultural commodities produced on illegally deforested land from entering the U.S. market, requiring companies to carry out risk-based due diligence on commodities linked to deforestation, increase U.S. engagement with countries that reduce deforestation, strengthen legal tools to fight deforestation-related corruption and financial crime, and to give a procurement incentive for deforestation-free products. 50 environmental, faith-based, human rights, and anti-corruption NGOs have urged you to enact this legislation. The U.S. Cattlemen, the National Confectioners Association, and the Sustainable Food Policy Alliance, that's known North America, Mars Incorporated, Nestle USA, and Unilever United States, all support regulating this trade. Just recently, 181 financial companies representing $2.9 trillion wrote a letter of support for the Forest Act. At the 2021 Climate COP in Glasgow, the United States and China agreed to collaborate in support of eliminating global illegal deforestation through effectively enforcing their respective laws on banning illegal imports. This is the law that would make that statement meaningful and to send a signal to any country that the U.S. will not be a safe haven for commodities that destroy the future of both the global environment and law-abiding farmers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. von Bismarck, I'd like to begin the questioning portion by recognizing myself. We successfully worked to pass the Lacey Act amendments, which banned trade in illegally harvested timber and wood products and provided tools to keep illegally harvested timber out of the United States. And as you referenced, last week the EU reached a provisional political agreement on a regulation to address global deforestation driven by commodities such as cattle, cocoa, and palm oil, like the Forest Act. Would you have, could you describe for us the similarities between the EU regulation and the Forest Act and the efficacy of banning imports of commodity harvested on illegally forested land?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the similarities are extensive. The EU regulation shares the same core actions as the Forest Act, which include focusing on the relevant commodities, and it has in fact chosen the same, more or less, commodities, the same scope that the U.S. legislation has. It focuses on mandatory due diligence with traceability in a risk-based system, in other words, from those locations where there is a great risk of deforestation. It then emphasizes cooperation with those countries to improve their actions to reduce deforestation and to provide the transparency information that U.S. companies would want in our case. I think it's a crucial moment, therefore, to follow suit. As I mentioned in my testimony, we don't want to be the place where the illegal deforestation commodities end up after Europe more effectively closes its doors. I think in terms of the efficacy of this type of legislation, I simply cannot think, if one is concerned about deforestation globally, of a single step that the world could do other than to detach this connection between global trade and commodities from the destruction of the last great forests on Earth. That's what's causing it. And the United States, as one of the main consumers, has an extraordinary opportunity, with Europe moving at the same time, to harmonize that approach in a way that it is pragmatic, that it supports U.S. manufacturing and U.S. farming. So whether it's climate change or whether it's U.S. manufacturing with these commodities, I cannot think of a single policy that would be more effective at improvement as this one.
Mr. von Bismarck, let me ask you about the importance of that. We reached a great bipartisan agreement with USMCA with strong enforceability chapter in it. Again, with Mr. Blumenauer's leadership, too, we have the Biden administration taking enforcement action on deforestation of the rainforest in Peru right now for the very first time. But how important is that in the enforceability of trade agreements to move this in the right direction?
Thank you. It's critically important. The application of that lever in the Peru Free Trade Agreement for Peru has been critical. The challenges absolutely continue, but as a result, the greatest flow of illegal wood out of the Peruvian Amazon was stopped in Houston Port, for example, and really shut down that entire trade. I think enforcement needs to improve, even with the mechanisms that were created. I think, if you have a free trade agreement and you agree to lower tariffs, then you should not use that as an excuse to move illegal goods into the United States, or to feel like you should, with that, also be able to hide the actual origin and the truth behind what's in those products. It appears that in the context of a free trade negotiation, the request to know what is coming into the country is a fair one. And I would maybe recommend that going forward, one even goes further along these lines, that information connected to the products coming into the United States That should not be a secret.
Mr. von Bismarck, in your testimony, you stated forest loss and degradation are among the biggest contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss, and are a root cause of zoonotic disease spillover events, such as those related to Ebola and coronaviruses. Could you further explain why we should take note of this potential health issue of diseases and pathogens, posing a global health crisis similar to the influenza zoonotic disease known as the Spanish flu of 1918 and the current lingering effects of COVID-19 on health security as well as economy? Could you delve into that a bit for us?
Thank you for the question. Well, forests mean an extraordinary amount of things to many people, and they provide what's called ecosystem services, which includes clean water, cycling of air, and the stability of the ecosystem that they contain. And in that part often comes the connection to potential disease outbreaks. Particularly lawless forestry and deforestation makes it extremely difficult for example, tropical countries to effectively manage a challenge of associated risks of disease with deforestation. And we're talking about lawless activity. So it doesn't even give you the opportunity to manage the situation. So you're losing the forest, you're changing ecosystem dynamics that run the risk of releasing disease, and you are reducing the ecosystem services that forest provides.
Let me start with Mr. Bismarck, but as we look at trying to address these goals and the need to work together, especially ideas such as friendshoring in combination with onshoring many of the manufacturing we're trying to do, do you have thoughts of how we can avoid the zero-sum game too many people want to play, that it's us versus them, but in fact the idea that we're all in this together?
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, I think it goes to the issue of transparency. Trade does not have to be destructive if we know what it is, if we know what is behind the products that we are exporting and importing. So I think in an effort for it not to be zero-sum game, we have to know what's behind it. And currently the technologies, the abilities to know what is behind a manufactured product, what is behind the commodities that are produced around the world, indeed what is behind natural gas, has greatly increased. And I think we need to catch up to what is possible in the information age of knowing what is actually behind trade. It can be reasonable, we can look at each sector and say what is possible today without being onerous, but we have to catch up.
Thank you so much. Mr. Bismarck, same question. Since your focus has been on deforestation, are there lessons learned from USMCA, from the Peru free trade, the Peru timber annex that we can apply to other regions of the globe in order to enhance environmental policy in areas that we might not have as much influence over?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I mean, the history of the battle over the last few years of better governance in the forests in Peru is one that is incredibly grateful for the influence of that mechanism of the Peru annex. There are many communities and indigenous people in Peru who were depending on the leverage that came with that annex to protect hard-fought gains in governance, hard-fought gains of creating entities in Peru that had independent oversight over illegal logging, these kind of things that came under incredible attack. So the effectiveness was shown. In terms of improving that going forward, I really appreciate the point about the cell phones just made by Mr. Hausman. We now have the ability in some countries to real-time track logging trucks, to allow citizens to be part of enforcement by using an app. This is about to be implemented in Gabon. It has been implemented in Romania. There is such a new level of information that could be connected to the enforcement mechanisms that have been created to really elevate them. So I would focus on forcing also enforcement agencies on the other side of these agreements to actively exchange information to allow these kind of cases that require information from both sides to effectively come forward.